There's a part in your book where you quote Freud, who wrote, "Nobody believes in his own death, or, and this is the same, in his unconscious, every one of us is convinced of his immortality." And you also quote Carl Jung, who seemed to agree to Freud's statement when he wrote, "On the whole, I was astonished to see how little ado the unconscious psyche makes of death. It would seem as though death were something relatively unimportant, or perhaps our psyche does not bother about what happens to the individual. But it does seem that the unconscious is all the more interested in how one does it. That is, whether that attitude of consciousness is adjusted to dying or not." And you follow that up by writing, "From this lack of concern, however, one can draw opposite conclusions by regarding it either as a revelation about the immortality of the collective unconscious or as a costly delusion." And I found this part, yeah, and I found this part interesting, as I've often had this thought that maybe, just maybe, our lack of concern or our ability to believe in our death is pointing to how there's ultimately no death. And of course, this can become a form of spiritual bypassing, because I think it's one thing to say that you accept death or see it as illusory, and it's another to truly understand this in your bone. It's one thing to say there is no self, and it's another for that realization to be embodied. But yeah, it's been an interesting thread. And for me also, with certain psychedelic experiences I had, which were like complete ego dissolving experiences, it just felt like, oh, this is what death is, like the dying of the ego. And it just felt illusory. It felt like that's the only real death. Like, yeah, the body dies, of course, but that's not where, just the psychological death is the problem. But once that's gone, it just, once that happens, it's the whole game seems so illusory. So I'm kind of curious, how do you think about or orient to death, and what is death to you?
Well, responding to the thing that you said at the very end here, and this brings us back to some earlier stuff, how in Sufism in particular, I think they put it very well: die before you die, so that when you die, you're already dead. And that's one way to put it. But I think that's a pretty good description. So when I was talking earlier about forgetting yourself, letting go of yourself, that's ego death. It really amounts to the same thing, right? And as you said, if we follow that path and are able to let go of ourselves completely, that's the most important transformation, I think. Now, what happens when we physically die? Well, I remember what the great 17th century Zen master Hakuin said. He was asked by a student, what happens to a great Zen master after he dies? And Hakuin said, "Why are you asking me?" And the guy said, "Well, you're a Zen master." And he said, "Yes, but not a dead one. Let's bring it back to this mystery. Death is the fundamental mystery. And, we're afraid, but part of the transformation we're talking about is not clinging to some after-death transcendent fate, but being able to accept the mystery without knowing, and that, I think, has been a very important stream, well, especially in the Zen tradition, which is my background. There's so much discussion of don't know mind and how essential that is. Knowing what we can know, but also being able to accept and live in the larger mystery of that which we don't know. And I think for me, the fundamental mystery is our physical mortality, our physical death. Getting back to this question of whether or not, I forget the actual question, but I remember a bit of the answer. in the sense of, I've been studying a lot of evolutionary psychology in the last few years. And, one of the points that people make is that a certain perception of time, a certain future orientation seems to be built into us because that makes it more likely that we're going to survive. So people who weren't concerned about whether they were going to survive, they didn't survive, or they were less likely to have children to survive, right? So this kind of preoccupation with the future, I think it may well be that that's kind of psychologically built into us just by the evolutionary process. And in that sense, it's not, from that perspective, the idea of death may be hard to integrate because we're always planning for the future, you see. And so that may be why we're preoccupied with what happens after we die. We're always trying to ground ourselves